Hi guys, welcome to virtual learning. I'm sorry that we can't be together this week, but this is the next best thing. So here goes nothing. We're going to talk today about rhetoric. And what I want you to do is, if you haven't done so already, go to the second slide and you're going to see a picture of Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird. And you are going to see a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. And for those of you who have not read To Kill a Mockingbird, you will be reading that next year. But in To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch gives an excellent speech that is filled with rhetoric, and that's why I've got his picture there. So anyway, let's start from the beginning. Rhetoric, and it's not said rhetoric, but rhetoric is basically using language to achieve your purpose. And according to Aristotle, who is a famous philosopher, I'm sure you've heard of him, he says that it's using any available means of persuasion. So essentially anything that you can do with language to persuade someone, that's rhetoric. Okay, so go ahead and move to the second slide. We're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So the first thing that you do anytime you have text that you're analyzing is we want to talk about the context, and we want to break down and analyze the context of the speech. So the first thing that you're going to look at is the audience, and we're going to ask the question, to whom is King speaking? So if you think back to the video that you watched on Monday, a lot of times the camera went out to the audience. And I want you to go back and look at that video, and I want you to pay attention to the audience that King is speaking to. Okay, then we move on to setting. And I want you to figure out, again, when you go back and you do a little research on King's speech, what is the time and place where King is speaking? And then some more specific questions about that is, what is going on in the world at the time? So contextually speaking, the broader context, what's happening at the time that King is giving his speech? And then what was the impetus or the reason for King's speech? So essentially, what prompted King to speak in this moment? Okay, then we're going to move on to purpose. Now this is your why. And you answer purpose with phrases like to inspire, to entertain, to explain. So I want you to think about King's reasons for his I Have a Dream speech. And that answers the why question, and that's his purpose. And then the last thing you're going to do when you're initially breaking down his speech, you're just starting off with these ideas, is what's his message? This is the what. What is King's theme? What message does he want his audience to hear? So when you think back to all of the other novels that we've read, we always talk about topics and we talk about themes. And just as a reminder, that topics like love and hate or prejudice or racism, those are not themes. A theme is the message or the idea that the author wants us to know about that topic. Okay, so when you finish listening to this and you finish going through all the slides, I want you to go back to your I Have a Dream speech, and I want you to write the answers to these questions where you have room on that speech. So you're going to look at the audience, the setting, specifically the time and place, and then what's going on in the world at the time, and then what do you think the impetus or the reason for King's speech is, and then his purpose and his message. And you're going to need to give yourselves a little bit of time to think about these things. Okay, go ahead and move on to the fourth slide. Okay, so we have the question, how does Martin Luther King Jr. use literary and stylistic devices as a means of persuasion? So just like in literature, speakers draw on literary devices. We can also call them stylistic devices. So something that you are familiar with, because we've talked about it a lot in the novels that we've read, are allusions. An allusion is a word or a phrase designed to call something to mind without actually mentioning that thing explicitly. So we have historical allusions and biblical allusions and literary allusions. And an example is when we read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. When the judge was found, he had a mark on his forehead. And if you recall, that mark was an allusion to the mark of Cain from the biblical story Cain and Abel. And it signified that the judge was a sinner. So without actually saying the biblical story Cain and Abel, Agatha Christie alludes to that. So she had us call that to mind without actually mentioning that explicitly. So if you see something in the speech, in King's speech, that specifically mentions an event in history or specifically mentions someone in the Bible or specifically mentions someone in literature, that's not necessarily an allusion. An allusion is something that prompts us to consider these things or to have them brought to mind. Okay, so then moving on to symbolism, that's an object that represents another idea or thing to give an entirely different meaning that is much deeper and more significant. So for example, the dove is a symbol of peace, or a red rose, or the color red stands for love or romance. Black is a symbol that represents evil or death. A ladder may stand as a symbol for a connection between heaven and earth, or a broken mirror may symbolize separation. So if you remember, as we went through our literature, I've always said to you things like weather is never just the weather, and doors are never just doors, and windows are never just windows. In A Raisin in the Sun, the plant wasn't just a plant. So you want to think about the deeper meaning of these symbols and look for recurring symbols throughout the pieces that we read, whether it's a speech or a short story or a novel. And think of symbols as something that is concrete, and it represents an abstract idea. Like the dove is concrete, but it symbolizes the abstract idea of peace. Okay, go ahead and move on to the 5th slide. Okay, imagery. We've talked a lot about imagery, and you've actually practiced your writing trying to employ imagery. And remember that imagery is not figurative language. Figurative language creates imagery. So imagery is using language that appeals to your senses. So it might evoke a sound or a taste. You can taste something, you can hear something, you can smell something. We practiced this when we wrote about our moments in time in your warm-up journals. It's using such rich language that it appeals to a reader's senses. Now, one way of doing that is to use figurative language. So devices like metaphors and similes, personification, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, all of those devices create imagery. Now, when you did that assignment where you went through King's speech and you tried to find all of the figurative language, some of you had a hard time because you found what seemed to be imagery, and you were correct. There were times you just couldn't identify the device he used to create that, and sometimes there isn't one. So it's okay if you find imagery and then you can't say that it's specifically a metaphor or specifically a simile or specifically personification. Just finding that rich language that appeals to our senses, that's okay, and that's the use of imagery. King also specifically uses point of view. He uses first-person point of view. Look for all the pronouns. He uses pronouns like I and we and us. He doesn't use pointed language or language that's accusatory like you. I mean, at times he'll do it, but he's really trying to connect with his audience and pull himself into this idea of freedom for all. So point of view is really important because you can change your tone with a specific point of view. And that leads us to tone. And remember, tone is a speaker's attitude toward the subject he or she is speaking. So when you think about the words, I'm sorry, you can say those so many different ways. You can say, I'm sorry, or I'm sorry, or sorry, right? And that all has to do with the attitude of the speaker. So the same thing with a speaker who's giving a speech, or an author who's writing a short story, or in poetry. When we looked at Claude McKay's poem, and we looked at Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, and all of Langston Hughes's poetry, you identified tone. And the way that an author or a speaker creates tone is through their syntax and their diction. So remember, syntax is sentence structure, and diction is word choice. And those two structures are really, not structures, those two ideas are really, really important. So think about how an author or a speaker uses words and sentences to shape their attitude and to convey that attitude. And the other thing you have to think about with tone is that there are tone shifts, like with Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die. He's indignant in part of his poem, and then he moves to being inspirational. And so if you can catch those shifts in a speech or a poem or a short story, that's really important. Okay, go on to the 6th slide. And now these are some of my favorite things, stylistic devices. And you will see a lot of this in a couple of years if you take AP language. And this is the fun stuff. So this is where you get to be creative with your writing, and you use artful syntax and artful diction. So the first couple that I want to go over employ repetition and parallelism. So that first blue bullet, the way that you say that is anaphora. An anaphora is the deliberate repetition of the first part of the sentence. So King masterfully does that with his I have a dream speech, and he repeatedly says, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. And I want you to go back through the speech and find other areas where he uses anaphora, and make sure you mark that. Okay, the second device I want to go over is polysyndeton. And it's actually the second and third bullets, polysyndeton and asyndeton. And this is a really easy artful structure to employ. Polysyndeton is just when you use several coordinating conjunctions in succession. So Charles Dickens used polysyndeton in his sentence. There were frozy fields and cowhouses and dunghills and dust heaps and ditches and gardens. And see the effect that that has? It's this building, this culmination of ideas. Now, the opposite of that is asyndeton, and that's where you intentionally eliminate conjunctions between the phrases in the sentence. So from Sophocles, he writes without looking, without making a sound, without talking. And you have a very different impact. I always think of a more poetic effect with asyndeton, but they're intentional uses of structure. And so you have to decide, well, do I want to build, and do I want to move more like to a climactic feel? And if I want to do that, then I use polysyndeton. And if I want to feel more lyrical and poetic, then I may use asyndeton. And then the last device on this page you've definitely heard of, and it's called alliteration. And that's just the succession of the same sounds that are placed within proximity of one another. And really, if you just have two, that qualifies as alliteration. But an example is Susie sells seashores by the seashore, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Okay, go on to the 7th slide. And I have one more stylistic device, and this is also really a literary device, and it's called a motif. And a motif is a recurring image, idea, or symbol. And what I want you to look for in King's speech is his use of nature. He has recurring references to natural elements. So go ahead through the speech, and I want you to identify all the areas where he references nature, and think about why he might have made the connection between what he's trying to say and those natural elements or elements in nature. Okay, and then the last slide. Again, according to Aristotle, rhetoric is using any available means of persuasion. So how do we persuade our audience? Well, there's 3 different rhetorical appeals. Okay, and appeals are different from devices. Devices are all the things I just talked about, like anaphora and polysyndeton and asyndeton and imagery and point of view. But these are appeals, and there's 3. And they're emotional appeals, logical appeals, and appeals of credibility. And in that order, it's called pathos, logos, and ethos. And again, this is really the foundation of AP Lang that you'll have in a couple of years, but I like to start it now, and then you get a head start. So when you are trying to persuade an audience, you have to consider who your audience is. And often an audience is varied. If you're speaking to a crowd like King was speaking to, and where there's hundreds of thousands of people, everyone has different beliefs and belief systems, and they are going to be persuaded in different ways. And some people will be persuaded emotionally, some will be persuaded with logic, some will be persuaded with the idea that you have shared values, or that you are an expert or have expert knowledge in an area, or you have a sincere tone, and that all goes with ethos. So think of it this way. An example would be, you forgot your homework at home, and the idea is that, let's say it was for Mrs. Vargas's class. Well, you are going to use a very different tactic to convince Mrs. Vargas to let you turn in your homework late than you would for, say, Mr. Solaire. So maybe with Mr. Solaire, you might go all logical on him and use specific details and facts and statistical data and talk about how, I've turned in my homework 32 times on time and today's the first day out of the entire year that I've done this. But maybe with Mrs. Vargas, you're going to go more emotional because you think she's a sucker and she's going to fall for that. And you're going to say, Mrs. Vargas, my cat was sick last night and I had to take care of my sick cat. And then it was just so late and I couldn't get to bed on time. So you get my point. You're going to change the appeals that you use based on who you're talking to. But if you're talking to a mixed crowd, which is usually the case, then you are going to have a mixture of those appeals so that you can persuade everyone who's in your audience. Okay, so I hope this went well for you. This was new for me. If you have any questions, let me know, but I'm really excited for this unit and I'm so sorry that we're not together for me to go over it with you because I really love it and I hope you love it too. Take care, guys. See you soon. Bye.